Okay, hello and welcome to any attendees that have just joined us. It's great to have you back here with us for part two of our training program. So we were just giving a moment for everyone to join us, but it looks like we've got a good number of attendees now, so let's get started. So a big welcome on behalf of myself to our second part of the two-part program on gender equality and global markets. So please feel free to reintroduce yourselves in the chat as we're getting started. But as we're getting going, I'd just like to say a big thank you again to our hosts, the Egyptian Exchange today, for supporting us and making today's session possible, and particularly to Mustafa and Maya for joining us here today as well. I'd also like to say a very grateful thanks to our partners on this program, to the IFC and to Amira for joining us as well, to our colleagues at UN Women, Columbia University, and the Luxembourg government as well. Okay, so in terms of our format today, we'll just be giving a quick recap on how the session works and how to access our materials before we get started. So firstly, just a reminder on the key functions that you'll need to use in Zoom in our training session today. So great to see a number of you already saying hello in the chat. Please feel free to continue to use the chat to share any general comments or introductions. If you have any particular questions for the team, whether those be technical questions or maybe something just about the practicalities of the workshop, please make sure to put your questions in the Q&A box. That just allows us to respond and answer you directly and make sure we've kept track and responded to all of those questions there. We'll have another 2 hour session again today. We'll take a short break in the middle. As I've mentioned already, we do really encourage you to ask your questions throughout the session. So please make the most of that opportunity to ask the experts today and feel free to share your questions in the Q&A throughout. Similarly, we'd really love to have your active participation in our training session. So please feel free to share your thoughts on the training as we're moving through it in the chat box. And we're going to use a number of forms of interaction again today. So make sure to take part in those interactive features using the polls and Menti. And finally, as we're coming up to the end of the training in our second part today, we'll share the details with you about how to receive your completion certificate. So to get your certificate, you'll need to complete the feedback survey, which we'll share with you at the end of the training. So stay tuned to hear more about that at the end. And a quick reminder as well that you can access all of the content from our training program and our part one session on Monday from the event page for today's session, which Landon's just shared with you in the chat. So we'll also add our recording from today to that page, and you can already access the recording from Monday's training on that session page as well. You'll find the guest speaker materials from our presenters there too, and all of the resources and contact details that we're mentioning in the training will be available in those handouts. So to cover off who our instructors for the training will be today. So firstly, it's myself and Landon again joining you from the SSE Academy team. And we're also pleased to welcome back our colleague from the UN Women team, Alexandra from the Women's Empowerment Principles Global Secretariat, who'll be coming back to tell us a bit more about their work later in the programme. Alexandra is also available in the background, so do ask your questions. I'm sure you should be interested to see any questions you might want to ask as well. And we have two guest speakers joining us for our training today. Firstly, we have Guillaume Jacques already here with us. So welcome, Guillaume, who is a sustainable finance analyst at the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. Guillaume will be talking to us in our first part of today's workshop about gender bonds. And then our second guest speaker, who will join us towards the end of the session today, is David Pritchett, the Managing Director of the EDGE Certified Foundation. If you remember, we touched on EDGE briefly in our first part of the training on Monday, a performance standard that you can use to support the development of your internal practices on equality. So David will join us towards the end of the session to tell us a bit more about that. And so, as a reminder, this course is broken into 4 modules, which we've developed to really walk you through. There's 4 steps for improving gender equality performance. So today we're going to be focusing on those second 2 steps on the screen: implement and communicate. So this is really building off what we learned last session. So we do hope that you were able to join us for our first part, but do please make sure to check out the recording if you did miss it. But moving on from what we covered in the first part of the training, we're going to be focusing on our second two aspects here today. So, thinking in particular about the different financial products that you can access or potentially develop if you're a financial institution to really capture market value from gender lens perspectives and to kind of support your efforts internally as well. And then in our final part of the training, Communicate, we're going to be thinking about who needs to access information on gender equality and how you can share that with them, particularly through your corporate reporting. So to help us achieve that, we've set two main learning objectives for today's session. So firstly, we'd like you to help to understand how to capture market value from gender equality performance, be that through gender smart investment strategies or through the creation of gender-focused financial products. And secondly, we'd like to help you today to communicate gender-related information with internal stakeholders and to identify the guidelines that you can communicate gender-related information with to external stakeholders as well, really focusing on how to ensure your investors are particularly getting the information they need. And just to show you how we're going to achieve those objectives in our session today, it's a similar format to part one of the training where we'll spend an equal amount of time roughly on our 2 units there. We'll take a short break in the middle and then we'll wrap up at the end of the session with some resources that you can use to continue your learning on these topics. Okay, so we'd like to go back to Menti again now, as we did in the first part of our training, to get a sense of how much you maybe already know about the topics we're going to be covering today, and maybe test a little bit as well your understanding of one of the concepts that we talked about in the first part of the course. So thanks, Landon, for sharing the link there in the chat to Menti. You can see on my screen now as well the QR code that you could use to join us in Menti as well, if you'd like to. And you can finally go to menti.com and enter that 8-number code you see on the screen there. But our first question is just to get an understanding of your current level of comfort with the different topics that we're aiming to talk to you about today. So firstly, to identify the value that gender equality can add to investment strategies, then to think about how you could communicate gender-related information to investors, and then finally to explore or explain to your colleagues the financial value of gender equality. So looks like we've only had a few responses so far, but those of you who've responded seem quite confident, so that's good to see. But don't be shy if you maybe are a little bit less familiar with these topics and want to let us know. That's no problem as well. And it's always good to know the mix of perspectives. But it looks like we have a bit of a range. So it looks like some of you are quite familiar with these topics and some of you perhaps a bit newer. So if any of you who are already working on these subjects would like to share in the chat as we're going along anything that you're working on here or any experiences you have, I'm sure that will be really useful to all of our other participants as well. So please feel free to do that. But thanks for letting us know. Okay, and then our second question for you now goes back to one of the concepts that we talked about in our part one training on Monday. And just a little bit of a test to see if you can remember one of the things we talked about before we go back to the slides and we'll recap that with you. So if a few more of you want to join, I'm going to give it a second or two before we launch the question. It's always good to get lots of participation, as I mentioned. Anyone else? Oh, we lost one person. We're going down. That's not good. Okay, we've got 11 of you there. Oh, thank you. A couple more. That's great. And let's launch our question for you all. So the question will pop up in a second, and then you'll have 30 seconds to answer it. So think back to what we talked about in part one. Is the objective here equity or equality? We did talk about both of those terms, so it's quite a tricky question in that sense. But maybe you can recall the different definitions we use there and what the overall objective is here. We'll show you a moment, a reminder of this, but it's good to test your memory and see if you can recall what we covered on that point. Okay, a couple more seconds and we'll see. Ooh, okay. So it looks like 11 of you went for equity and seven equality, but equality was indeed the right answer regarding the overall objective here. So well done to those of you who got that point right. But sounds like a bit of a recap might be helpful. So let's go back then to the presentation and we'll take a look at that together. Okay. So what we were asking about there goes back to this kind of equation or diagram that we shared with you in our first session. So we've said that the overall objective is equality, and this really shows in the diagram how equality breaks out in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion as all important elements. So diversity, if you remember, was all around ensuring that we have multiple identities represented. So this could include sex, gender, culture, race, ethnicity, religion, age, disability, and other factors as well. And diversity we would refer to as making sure that there are enough seats at that table in the boardroom, as it were. Of course, this applies beyond the boardroom, but let's use that for our analogy here. Then, if we move into equity, this was all around recognizing and reorganizing power distribution. So, equity could be thought of as really having the microphone to enable you to speak in that meeting. And then, last but not least, we also must consider inclusion as well. So, that's ensuring that every individual feels welcomed and that they have equal opportunities to connect, belong, and grow within that community or organization. So we could say that inclusion could be a little bit like having the headset to allow us to interpret and understand what each other says and allow everyone to feel a part of the conversation. So that's a little recap there. And then just to focus on a few other things that we talked about. Um, Last time we talked about preparation, where we set the groundwork for understanding key terminology, the business and the human rights case. And we looked at how the world was doing so far in terms of gender equality in corporate leadership. So, as a reminder, we learned that improving gender equality provides many benefits in society. And so, the economy beyond the boardroom or the corporate environment is also at play here. For example, we saw that studies have shown that gender equality can potentially decrease violence in society, increase economic productivity, and also increase resilience against financial and environmental crises. But just as a reminder, we're not saying that women themselves necessarily are solely driving all of these benefits, but really it's that overall equality perspective that helps to deliver that impact. But let's also remember that increasing equality in corporate leadership has also been found to create important benefits, such as increased profit, increased transparency, and improved environmental impacts linked to the business's role in this as well. And if you will recall, we also learned about the UN Women's Empowerment Principles, and Alex shared with us how these principles can be used to help you get started on enhancing gender equality. And as a reminder, measurement and reporting, you'll see that is one of those principles, as well as action number 5 relating to the supply chain. So those are 2 points that we're going to pick up and discuss in a bit more detail today. And a final brief reminder, if you recall, in our last part of the training, we took that kind of case study activity through where we talked about those two companies, Owl Inc., Peacock PLC, and the different approaches that they took to implement gender equality quotas and targets in their organization. Really showing how important corporate culture is in making sure that we set ourselves up for success here. So, however good our intentions are, if we don't take into consideration corporate culture and those barriers that might be preventing improvements in equality, we won't necessarily achieve our objectives and we could waste resources or even potentially make the problems worse. So, a good point to keep in mind as well that all these different facets need to be considered when we're aiming to make a cultural change in our organizations. Okay, so hopefully that gives us a little bit of a recap from last time, so we're all up to speed on what we talked about. Now let's transition into our next unit, which really looks at gender lens finance and the market mechanisms that can support the implementation of the principles that we discussed with you on Monday. So I'll hand over to Landon, who's going to get us started on that.
Great. Thanks, Fiona, and welcome again, everyone. So, when looking at implementation of gender equality, we'll talk a bit about some products that support market action, and we'll also look at mechanisms that add value and promote and advance gender equality in capital markets. We'll first take a look. Oh, okay. Oh, sorry, I don't think I can share slide or move slides right now. But anyways, to get started, we want to look at how financial products are being used to support gender equality and what opportunities lie within those financing mechanisms for gender allied companies. To get started, we'll take a look at some of the trends we're seeing in sustainable finance more broadly. So this chart here you can see from a previous UNCTAD World Investment Report, and it shows here that in 2024, the total number of sustainability themed bonds, or excuse me, funds exceeded 7,500, which has obviously grown significantly over the 5 or 6 years preceding 2024. There is a bit of a slowdown in the rate of growth since 2021. But the funds are still at about 3.2 trillion. I just want to note briefly on the slowdown, that was due to a number of factors, depressed asset values, looming risk of recession in many markets around the globe. Many markets were facing high inflation, rising interest rates, poor market returns, etc. So, as such, sustainability themed funds still remain an important tool to direct capital towards sustainable development. And we're also seeing growth in gender lens investing. However, the data on gender lens investing is a bit more difficult to capture. We'll discuss a little bit more on that later on. So we have less of a clear idea of exactly the total asset values in gender lens investing, but there are different estimates that we can use. We don't have enough time today to dive more into this specific topic, but we've provided some extra slides for you that you can review in your own time. Excuse me. Right. So you might be asking yourself, what is gender lens investing? We've mentioned it a few times now, so we'll take a moment to discuss it. So if you could share in the chat, what do you think gender lens investing is? Okay, if you don't really have an idea of what gender lens investing is, feel free to give a try, maybe just a few words, or if you have a working definition, feel free to share it too. Okay, Nada notes promoting economic opportunities, directing funds to gender-related businesses, financial impact of gender. Okay, great. Those are all really good answers. We'll take a look at an official definition. Now, there are different definitions, but we think this one from the Global Impact Investing Network, or GIIN, is a good start. So, Global Impact Investing Network defines gender lens investing as investment strategies applied to an allocation or to the entirety of an investment portfolio, which seek to examine gender dynamics to better inform investment decisions and or intentionally and measurably address gender disparities. So, as the name gender lens investing, I think makes clear, we use gender as a lens or a way of viewing things and seeing things that can help an investor to highlight opportunity, illuminate risk, and understand strategy in a more nuanced way. You might also ask, how are investors using that gender lens to make investment decisions? And there's many different strategies here. Some of the core strategies we do see look specifically at what focus an investment strategy with a gender lens takes, but we often see a combination of many or multiple or perhaps all of these strategies used to varying degrees. The most common strategy you are probably already familiar with is a focus on leadership, perhaps looking, in our first session on number of women on boards or number of women CEOs and or women founders. But there's also other areas that we see investment strategies focusing on, like employees, supply chains, products and services, as well as the community. At the firm level, we see fund managers driving the adoption of gender lens or gender smart investing by starting within their own investment house. So fund managers can strengthen the gender diversity of their own teams, for example, by setting leadership targets or building a respectful workplace culture or making public commitments to advancing gender diversity and equality. The IFC's also developed a framework that we link to on this slide that includes designing a gender smart investment strategy, engaging, training, and rewarding people within a firm, enhancing or adapting investment processes and systems, and identifying and collaborating with partners and external stakeholders at the firm level. Now, I want to switch gears a little bit. So, still with fund managers, but now at the portfolio level, these fund managers can adopt strategies in both origination and portfolio management. Those strategies enable fund managers to allocate capital to companies that are committed to these five key areas on your screen. First, we see women represented in leadership, as I mentioned, perhaps as CEOs, founders, or senior management. We also see a gender diverse and equitable workforce, a gender inclusive value chain, or offering and designing products or services that consider the distinct needs of women and ensuring their operations do no harm in the community. The good news here is that as the benefits of gender diversity have become more and more widely recognized in recent years, we've also seen investor demand for gender smart investment opportunities increasing considerably. That's led to the emergence of a number of different gender-focused financial products across asset classes. I'll just give a brief overview. We'll also share later on a report we did on gender lens investing as well. So on the left-hand side, we can see there's a few buckets of the financial products. So we see equity, gender lens funds, and debt or fixed income. And then on the right-hand side, we can see the investors accessing these financial products also vary, like the investment vehicles. So we're seeing both retail or institutional investors, for example, making use of these different vehicles. It's important to note because different investors have different needs and expectations. Perhaps a retail investor has different needs than an institutional investor, and so on. So that results in this diversity of products to meet those different needs. As mentioned, before we dive into a few case studies, I just wanted to take a moment to quickly share about a publication we released just last year on gender-themed financial products. The report provides an inventory and analysis of approximately 300 different gender-themed financial products that are actively on the market, like bonds, equity funds, and indices. So all the vehicles I just mentioned. And these were found in both emerging and developed markets. Just a few key insights. So we see gender-themed financial products remaining quite niche, but that's not to say that they aren't important. But when you compare, for example, the assets under management of a gender-themed fund versus a non-gender themed fund, you see a big difference in the average fund size. And then we also saw index or market-based products, which could also be called knowledge products. So they're not products that investors, whether retail or institutional, can directly invest in. Rather, they help guide those investors. They comprise a substantial share. And we also saw government-issued gender bonds are particularly prominent in emerging markets as compared to developed markets. But we also saw these bonds and funds. We compared them to the UN Women WEPs, and we saw a lot of inconsistent alignment. So we think that these funds can do better with aligning more to the WEPs. And in some, we also saw different definitions. So we think you could benefit, or the market could benefit from more standardized definitions, reporting frameworks, taxonomies, because right now, the lack or the inconsistent alignment between these definitions, frameworks, and taxonomies can lead to concerns about gender washing, sometimes referred to as pink washing, where gender labels may be used without demonstrating real impact. So the report urges greater integration of gender equality into sustainable finance taxonomies, also stronger verification mechanisms, and greater alignment with the WEP and SDG 5 so that we ensure that these gender-themed investments are delivering meaningful outcomes and creating the impact that they strive to achieve. Now let's take a look at a few case studies of some gender products. So building on Monday's discussion, the Longo Safe Water Project in Uganda is a great example of how climate and gender can benefit or work in tandem to result in benefits. So in 2020, this credit system became the first gold standard gender responsive certification. The project is focused on rehabilitating boreholes, providing clean drinking water to 40,000 people, as well as reducing 50,000 tons of CO2 every year. And then the social impact, I think, is where this project really stands out. So households are saving 4 hours a week on water collection. That is time gained back almost exclusively by women and girls who bore the responsibility of that task. And then the Water Resource Committee, so it's kind of a leadership role. That committee has gained near parity with 46% female representation. So we're seeing women actually act in these leadership roles around the project. A striking statistic is that reported domestic violence related to water collection has dropped from 35% to zero. And then almost every woman surveyed for this study and follow-up was saving time from the water collection and using that for income generating activities. So they're getting a bit more purchase power or economic power in the market as well. It's important to understand that while gold standard requires all projects to be gender sensitive, this project specifically went an additional step further to become gender responsive. That means they move beyond just doing no harm, and then they're actively setting targets to reduce gender inequality. So for anyone looking to buy credits, this project offers some high integrity carbon reductions that are also rigorously vetted for social impact. This next example here is the dual benefit bond on GenderSmart. So this is the example of the integration of dual benefits or co-benefits of financial products such as bonds. We are going to hear a bit more about this from Guillaume, who will share a little bit more. I'm just checking our time to see. Yeah, okay. We have time to quickly run through this. So this is the world's first gender equality loan, where a Turkish company, Polat Energy, received a $44 million loan in 2019 for the construction of Turkey's largest wind farm to date. However, rather than just issuing a green bond, the company actually integrated gender equality metrics, and its performance will then be assessed and evaluated based on a series of gender-related criteria and metrics. And it was also agreed that the improvements on those metrics would then enhance or improve the terms of that loan. Criteria for this included actions such as return to work programs for employees returning from maternity leave, ensuring gender equality in new hires, prioritization of women-owned enterprises in their supply chain, measures to avoid gender pay gaps, policies to prevent harassment, as well as trainings to overcome unconscious negative biases against women. Then the score, which can be calculated according to a methodology developed by Guarantee BBVA, can reveal the gender equality performance of Polat Energy along the entire value chain that they have. And then Guarantee BBVA will also be ready to support Polat Energy with their own HR department as well if there's need. As well, in addition to rewarding, not reporting, rewarding Polat Energy for improving their gender equality. This gender loan also seeks to encourage other sustainable infrastructure companies to adopt gender inclusive practices, and we think it serves as an example to other financial institutions as well. We're also seeing some other similar metrics and financing considerations being integrated into carbon credits, such as the W plus standard, which allows the accreditation of carbon projects and the credits that are issued to be certified with quantifiable contributions to women's empowerment. There is one more example on bonds, which you can review in your handout. That example comes from IFC and their Banking on Women program. We definitely recommend checking out this IFC Banking on Women website, which Fiona just shared in the chat. There's a lot of great examples and resources there if you are looking for any other case studies or information. But in the interest of time, we'll keep moving along and dive a bit deeper into what exactly it means to list or invest in gender bonds.
Great. Thanks for that overview, Landon. So, moving on now, as we said, we're going to take a little bit of a deeper look at the particular topic of gender bonds. So, I think firstly, the starting point here is what exactly are bonds for anyone who isn't familiar with that, and then what gender bonds are. So, I'll just give a broad overview of this topic, and then Guillaume will be coming in a little bit after that to talk to us about this in more depth. So to start with, if you're not familiar with the term bonds, a bond is a fixed income investment product which is issued by a government or by a company to raise funding for its activities, projects, etc. And at the end of a set period, the bond issuer, so that's the company or government that issued that bond, will repay investors with interest in addition to the original value of the bond. And so I think what's important here is this is relevant for both companies who could issue a bond and also financial institutions who might be interested in investing in that type of product as well. And so within that definition, we have a particular growing theme of sustainability bonds, which are bonds that are designed to finance or refinance environmental or social projects. And then if we think about gender bonds more specifically, these are a subset of bonds within the overall sustainability bond universe. So at the moment, gender bonds are often not seen as a specific category of bonds in themselves, like we might see for green bonds, if you're familiar with that on the environmental side. But we are increasingly seeing more bonds that have a gender focus, either by having specific KPIs relating to gender or because they're linked to projects that support or enhance gender equality. And I think what we also want to highlight here is that we can see a distinct overlapping between green bonds for climate and gender co-benefits as well, which we heard about in some of those case studies that Landon has already shared with us. So if we have a little bit of a look at the specific trends in relation to social bonds, we'll go back to the World Investment Report, which we shared with you earlier. So we can see that overall, there has been a growth in sustainable finance through social bonds over the last 5 years. So the cumulative issuance of sustainable bonds reached a record level of just over 1 trillion US dollars in 2024. And so, although we have seen some declines in 2020, as you'll see in that data, this was found to be in line with trends in the broader bond market as well. But overall, it is clear that social and mixed sustainability bonds are on a longer term growth trajectory. And we can see if we go back to 2019, we've got a 19% increase to 2024 in the number or value of bonds in the market. And so it's important specifically to say as well, since 2020, we've seen a growth in that social and sustainability bond segment as well. So those bonds that would potentially be capturing gender-related objectives. And that now accounts for around a third of the total sustainable bond market. So there are a number of guidelines that we can use to help us determine what should qualify as a gender bond. Importantly, these guidelines can be useful to you both as an issuer of a bond and also an investor as well, looking to make sure that your investments are contributing to real gender equality impact. So there's two examples of these types of guidelines on the screen. One, the social bond principles, and also the climate bonds initiative's particular methodology for determining if a bond would be included in its social and sustainability bond database. So Guillaume's going to talk to us about some more guidance and considerations on this topic. But I think what we want to highlight here is that these guidelines are really designed to build trust in the market and to ensure that social bonds are designed in a way that will allow them to achieve the positive objectives that they're intended to meet. So, of course, it's not enough just to call something a gender focused bond. We need to really understand and make sure we're delivering that impact as well. So that just gives us a little bit of an introduction here. So I'm very pleased to see we have Guillaume who's just come on screen to join us to talk more about this topic. So a big thank you, Guillaume, and I'll pass the floor over to you now and stop sharing my screen so you can share yours.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and thank you for having me today. So yes, I'm Guillaume, working in the Luxembourg Green Exchange team, which is the sustainable finance team of the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. And today I will present gender-focused bonds. And for that, let me just share my slides. Here we go. Okay, so what are gender-focused bonds? So it all started and actually started to gain traction with this document, which was published by ICMA, UN Women, and the IFC, which is Bonds to bridge the gender gap, a practitioner's guide to using sustainable debt for gender equality. It was published in 2021, and it had objectives both on the issuer side, but also on the investor side. On the issuer side, the goal of this document was to support new and existing bond issuers, but also all the stakeholders which are implied in bond issuances in order to integrate gender equality objectives into sustainable investments. On the investor side, the goal of the document is to help investors to understand but also support projects which are directly linked to gender equality. This document really serves as a practical guide with lots of examples for the two types of gender bonds. So use of proceeds bonds, but also key performance indicators, so KPIs, and sustainability performance targets for sustainability linked bonds. But we will touch upon that a bit later in the presentation. So as I mentioned, there are two types of gender-focused bonds, the first one being use of proceeds bonds and then SLBs. We will start with the use of proceeds bonds. So what are they? So as it was mentioned just earlier, these are green, social, or sustainability bonds. And how do we identify gender-focused bonds at our exchange? We look if there is a link to SDG 5, or Sustainable Development Goal number 5. And there are two cases. The first one is when 100% of the proceeds are foreseen to be used for gender equality, so for SDG 5. Then in that case, we can already assess that the bond is gender focused in pre-issuance, thanks to the framework where we see that it's linked to SDG 5. And the second case is when one bond finances a lot of different projects. So it can finance a lot of different project categories. Let's say, for example, renewable energy, clean transportation, education, and one category which is linked to SDG 5. Then in that case, we will have to make sure that some of the proceeds are used towards gender equality. So we will wait typically 1 year for the post-issuance report to be published. In this post-issuance report, we will verify that there is indeed a link to gender equality and that some of the proceeds were used towards it. And in that case, the bond will be labeled as gender focused on our platform effectively 1 year after the issuance. So this is for the use of proceeds bonds. Now let's go to the SLBs. So just as a reminder, what is a sustainability linked bond? So a sustainability linked bond will have at least one KPI and one SPT, which is linked to the KPI. But there can be, of course, multiple KPIs and SPTs. And what is the KPI? So it will be, I'll already use an example for gender focused bonds. So for example, it can be the percentage of women in the board, and the SPT, the target will be in that case, let's say as an example, to reach 30% of women in the board by 2030. If the target is missed, there can be a penalty mechanisms, and this is really the specific case for SLBs. So there can be a penalty mechanism, which could be, for example, an increase in the interest paid to investors, so a coupon step up. But there can be also an inverse mechanism. So if the target is met, then in that case, there could be a coupon step down. So less interest paid to investors. There are multiple penalty mechanisms. So this could be, for example, linked on the interest, but this could be a donation. This could be an increase in the redemption price, for example. But actually, it really can affect any financial characteristics of the bond. How do we identify gender-focused SLBs? Then, in that case, there must be at least one KPI and thus at least one SPT which targets SDG 5. So one SLB could have multiple KPIs and SPTs, but there must be at least one which is linked to gender equality to be labeled as gender focused. So now that I've explained what these are, we can move to case studies. And we will start with a use of proceeds bond, which was a social bond from a commercial bank in Tanzania, which is NMB Bank. And we have an interview of Aziz Shasha, which is treasurer at NMB Bank, on financing women-owned businesses. So I'll share the video. Here we go.
It's a commercial bank, Universal Commercial Bank, based in Tanzania, East Africa, that serves retail clients, corporate clients, and government. I'm the treasurer for the bank. So main responsibility really is around mobilizing funds. So liquidity management, foreign exchange risk management, interest risk management, and coordination just to make sure that there's balance sheet optimization and as well as capital allocation. So our gender bond really is a use of proceeds bond, that we issued in line with the international capital markets principles under the social bonds framework that allows us to raise money from the public and finance, women-owned businesses or enterprises that are dominantly owned by women, or businesses whose products and services actually eventually, service the female. Women proposition is a very important segment for our bank. And yes, we had a very fantastic proposition for women's savings, but we realized on the financing side, we needed to do something to mobilize additional funding to support growth for women-owned businesses. So we felt it was necessary for us, because a strategic fit for us is really to diversify portfolio. And given the risk profile of women as far as loans is concerned, we realized that the non-performing loans ratios are actually lower than that of the male counterparts. Yes, so the projects we tend to finance, or that we're financing with these, are predominantly female-owned enterprises, and it cuts across different sectors, be it renewable energy, agriculture, health, education, and manufacturing as well. Obviously, it would be interesting that we measure the number of new loans that are issued to MSCs, so micro to medium and small enterprises women. But also it would be interesting for us, and we're doing that, to measure what impact that is having on the social and economic life. So how many jobs are created? Are they growing? Are they not? Are they expanding their businesses? I think those kind of metrics are very important, and is part of our KPIs in ensuring that these funds actually put the right use. Indeed, we've issued other types of bonds, retail bonds, corporate bonds. The difference with this gender bond is that the use of proceeds requires a lot of transparency. Investors require that you go back to them to tell them, how these funds have been used. But in addition to that, it has to go in line with, the social bond principles, and in line with the international capital markets, principle on social bonds. As opposed to the other bonds that you could simply raise and finance all manner of activities, without accountability to the investors. This requires significant accountability and transparency as far as investors are concerned. It was very well received by investors, domestic investors, and as well as international investors. As a matter of fact, it got 197% oversubscription. So we had significant appetite seeing from international financiers, but as well as domestic retail and corporate investors. I think one obvious one was the misconception, that you have a gender bond in the market, financing women, and therefore there was a perception that perhaps the bond subscribers were meant to be female. And so it requires a lot of effort, marketing efforts, to ensure that the male counterparts actually understood that it's not just for female, but they could also invest to help advance female. So that was a key challenge for us. But the other one is obviously data quality, especially in some of these emerging markets, still remains to be an issue. So you need to have to capture the right data at onboarding stage becomes very important, because you really get to realize how critical that is when you're doing your impact measurement and reporting. But the other aspect is the opportunities are still huge. The financing gap for female generally is still quite huge, and that is why that is why there's need for us to perhaps also consider scaling up, such insurances, going forward. Yes, just related to the previous question. So we realize we need to do more still, so certainly we need to raise more funding, be it domestically, be it partnering with DFIs or developing financial institutions, to just make sure that we can scale up, that portfolio. The need is there. I think we need to answer a very critical question of affordability, which keeps coming up, and hopefully using things like guarantee schemes from some of these development financial institutions will enable us actually affordably extend credit to female entrepreneurs. I think critical for me, again, back to what I've said, is data, at the onboarding stage. You need to get it right. But at the same time, just ensuring that indeed you have a pipeline that's sufficient enough to be covered whatever amount of bonds you want to raise, because ultimately investors demand, that level of transparency and accountability to see that the bonds are actually put to the intended use.
All right, we're done with the video. Switch back to the presentation again. So to give you a bit more details on this bond, which was issued by NMB Bank. So it was issued in April 2022 and listed in Tanzania, but also listed in 2023 on Luxembourg Stock Exchange to gain international investors' visibility. And as it was also mentioned, the proceeds were used, actually, at least in part, to finance over 2,000 women MSMEs in Tanzania, which is really relevant in the region because 75% of women in Tanzania struggle to obtain access to finance. So this is really relevant and impactful for these bonds to be used to finance women. As it was also mentioned, the bond was oversubscribed by 197%, which shows that there is clear demand for these types of bonds. And yes, I think that's pretty all for the use of proceeds bonds. Now let's switch to the SLBs. So this is actually an SLB from EQT Group, which is a global investment firm with headquarters located in Sweden. And their bond had 3 different KPIs and 3 SPTs. And 2 of the KPIs are linked to women and SDG 5. You can see them on the bottom left. So the first KPI is Women Investment Advisory Professionals, and the linked SPT is increase the share, so the share of women to 28% by 2026, and the baseline was 21%. And the second KPI linked to gender equality is Women Independent Board Members appointed at certain EQT portfolio companies, with the SPT to increase the share to 36% by 2026. And the baseline was 21% in 2020. If these SPTs, if these targets are missed in 2026, then there would be an increase in the interest rate, which is the mechanism of SLBs. This bond was also oversubscribed, which also shows that there is strong demand even for SLBs which are gender focused. And that is it from my side. If there are any questions, please feel free and I will be happy to respond to them.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. I think a great overview there. So we have had one question come in actually, which is quite interesting. So a participant has asked if you could offer any advice about how to be confident about the pipeline of eligible clients before issuing the bond, which I think is a really interesting point. I'm not sure if you have any perspective on that.
So if I understand well the question, so the goal would be to know how to know who to finance with these kinds of bonds.
Yeah, I think basically to know that the demand would be there in the market before the bond was issued, if you see what I mean.
To be honest, I don't really have any takeaways on this. That's really difficult from a stock exchange perspective to answer this question, to be honest.
Yeah, no, of course, no problem. And I think maybe some of the materials that you've shared with the case studies might be interesting to look at for those the companies who've issued bonds in terms of the company experience there, which I guess is probably relevant to that question. But no, appreciate your presentation very much. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll just share the presentation again. We'll go back into the slides. So, moving on now to the final part of this module before we take our break. We've talked there about the different types of products that you could invest in. And now we'll talk here about the approach to promotion of these products in the market, which maybe speaks a little bit to the question that just came up there. So at the SSE, we did an assessment of how exchanges are working with their markets to enhance gender equality as part of our guidance for exchanges. And we found that there were really two main ways that markets were promoting gender equality. So firstly, through the promotion of participation of women, and then secondly, through the promotion of impact. So focusing on how the products actually have positive impacts on gender equality. So, what do we mean by promoting participation in markets? Well, we're really seeing the application of a gender lens in global markets now across both the sell side and the buy side to help access underserved segments of the market. So, on the sell side, so that's firms that create, promote, and sell financial products, we're seeing markets promoting and supporting women-led businesses or female entrepreneurs. An example of this is the Sourcing to Equal project led by the IFC in partnership with the Women Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative and Norway. And this aims to connect 5,000 women entrepreneurs to new markets via corporate procurement. And I think we've got a couple of examples of Sourcing to Equal that we can share with you in the chat as well. And then on the buy side, so that's the institutions that manage money and buy securities to generate a return for themselves and their clients. We can see that investment in and support of women-led traders is also a growing focus as well. And so this it comes back to what we talked about really earlier around the different types of gender lens investment strategies, because these operate not just at the portfolio level, but also within the investment firm itself. And this is because it has been well documented that all male investment teams are likely, of course, to invest in fewer women-led businesses. So that's an area that needs to be addressed as well. An example of this type of promotion is an annual women-focused investment summit, which is run by the Johannesburg Stock Exchange called JSE She Invests. So in addition to providing a networking opportunity, this event covers a variety of topics, including finance and investment literacy, and also showcases different ways in which women can invest in the market. And then the other facet of this that we have identified in our study was the fact that exchanges and markets are starting to promote particular financial products and companies based on their impact or their real world ability to actually improve gender equality, either within their own organization or as a contribution more broadly in society through their business model. And here we're seeing markets starting to raise awareness of financial products and promote the listing of products through awards or incentive schemes with the objective of shining a spotlight on those that are having a positive impact. And we're also starting to see markets creating particular segments or indices focused on gender equality that make it easier to find and invest in those high impact stocks or financial products that are driving impact. And here you see two examples of this type of indice, the Euronext Gender Equality Index and the Bloomberg Gender Equality Index. So I think it's important to note that one index can vary from another. And as we heard already, in order to capture a really holistic picture, which we know is important, as we heard about earlier in the week, we'll need to look at this topic from different perspectives. So, for example, here you can see that these indices are collecting quite a range of different informations about how corporates approach and manage this topic across the way they operate. And if we saw, for example, that these indices were maybe only looking at one or two statistics around, the percentage of women on boards, this would only let us know one aspect of gender equality within a company. And so in some instances, of course, this might be what we want to know, but if we're looking to really invest with that objective of driving capital towards companies that are having a real impact, of course, we might want to get broader data that enables us to understand that better. And so these types of indices could be a helpful benchmark to use as a corporate to understand, if you're disclosing the types of metrics that financial markets are really looking for here, and to help you to start to plan maybe for the types of data that you could start to collect to gain a more comprehensive picture, and ultimately, of course, support your potential inclusion in these types of indices in the future as well. And I think another important point here is that having this more full and complete data can really help us to understand if we're taking the right steps we need internally to solve the problem. Because if we don't really understand the full picture, we could be missing the mark or even potentially making things worse as well. Okay, so now we've got a quick poll question just to close out this segment, which is just to reflect on the different reasons we think that gender lens investment might be something that investors are increasingly focused on. So why is it that we think that investors are particularly interested to start focusing on this topic? And I'll give you a moment to have a think, but you can select more than one option here if you think there's multiple right answers, and then we'll have a look at the answers together. Okay, let's give it a few more seconds. It's always good to get good participation in the polls. We had about a third of you respond so far. Let's wait and see if we can get a couple more answers to the poll. It's nice to know if you're definitely there on the other end of the computer. So it's always great if you can take part. Thank you, everyone. Okay, give it a 5, 10 more seconds, and then we'll have a look at the answers together. Okay, let's end the poll and I'll share those results with you. So it looks like we've got a range of options there, maybe the most popular ones being to diversify portfolios and manage gender risks. Indeed, those are both good reasons why investors would be focused on this. But I think as we can see from your answers here, everything except the fourth answer here is a correct answer and is a possible reason, of course, that investors could be interested in this because there are many benefits potentially that investors could open up by focusing on this factor. But of course, as we've already established, gender lens investing shouldn't be seen as a zero-sum game. It's not about preventing men from moving forward so that women can instead. And if that's the outcome and how it's being perceived, then of course, then something's probably not being done right. So it's really about that equality perspective that we keep coming back to. Great. Okay, so that brings us now to the middle point of our session, and we're going to take a quick break again as we did before. So I'll play you that 5-minute timer. So feel free to take a little bit of a break away from your desk. But if you do have any questions or comments as we've moved through the training, feel free to share your questions in the Q&A or comments in the chat. But otherwise, we'll start back again in 5 minutes. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a quick chance to grab a cup of tea or coffee, and we'll get going again. So, we've had a look at some of the different financial instruments available to promote gender equality. Now, we'll look at how an organization can communicate about their performance on gender equality, which can be one means of accessing these gender-specific financing mechanisms. However, it's not only important for communicating with investors about your impact, but also internal communication is key to ensure that the culture change that we've discussed so much today and in the previous session actually can take place. We know it's a necessary aspect of performance, so making sure this takes place is, of course, important. With that, the final unit of our training on Communicate has two main sections. We'll talk both about communication and transparency internally or within an organization, among the employees, as well as with external stakeholders. To start with, let's look at how you can manage communication with suppliers. And while there's many methods used to enhance transparency within an organization, what we want to highlight here is today is the concept of gender responsive procurement, or GRP, which can be used as a tool to advance gender equality, not just within an organization internally, but also within the wider marketplace where an organization is operating. And then to guide us on this, we're welcoming back Alex from UN Women and the WEPS team, who will discuss some tools provided by the WEPS team to support you all on this topic. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Alex.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Wonderful to see you again. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Perfect, I got the control, I'll do it myself. Great. Apologies. So as Landon already introduced, we will be looking a bit more about communicating performance on gender equality and how to engage with your suppliers. So oftentimes when we talk about supplier engagement, companies might associate this with compliance or requirements towards your suppliers. But today we'll be taking a slightly different angle. It's really about engaging with them because they are so critical to help a company extend their impact far beyond the immediate operations and into the value chains. By promoting gender equality among your suppliers, as a business or businesses strengthen suppliers' performance, ensure their compliance with the law, and build more inclusive, resilient value chains for all. So this also helps turn our commitment and shared values into measurable impact, and it benefits both the business itself as well as the wider business sector and society. So supply engagement is all about partnership, support, and mutual benefits. Companies can set the tone by clearly communicating expectations, assessing where suppliers stand, and then providing practical tools and incentives and support to help suppliers improve as well. So it's really working together. And it's really about developing this gender responsive ecosystem. At the Women's Empowerment Principles Secretariat, we encourage and guide WEPS signatories to systematically source their goods and services from other enterprises that align with the WEPS or with gender equality. And when WEPS signatories purchase from other WEPS signatories, they multiply their impact on gender equality, enhance their supplier diversity, and also reduce systemic discrimination beyond their business. So this can not only, depending on whether you are a large company or a medium-sized company, pursuing gender-responsive procurement enhances both your own but also your suppliers' opportunities to grow, to gain exposure to new business networks and high-value market opportunities, as well as sustainable revenue streams. So before you engage and communicate with your suppliers, it's important to understand where your company stands when it comes to gender responsive procurement. So for this, the Women's Empowerment Principles has developed the Gender Responsive Procurement Assessment Tool, or GRP assessment tool. And this is a self-assessment tool for WEPS signatories to see where they stand in terms of their procurement policies and practices. We have been encouraging our signatories to take the tool and to use the tool, and even further to encourage their suppliers to take the tool and to create an impact for the whole ecosystem. The tool overall is 31 questions covering 5 main themes. So it looks at your gender equality commitments, it looks at procurement and policy strategies, internal procurement and supply chain management department, as well as diversity within that department, supplier databases and data reporting that are in place, as well as supplier engagement and diversification. Based on the data that you provide when you're going through the assessment, you will receive a scorecard that highlights gaps and areas for improvement, but also where you are strong. And this is similar to the gender gap analysis tool, which then also helps companies understand where they are and what they can do. All of the data is strictly confidential, and the results will never be linked back to an individual company. So you can go onto our website and use the tool there if you're a web signatory. So just like developing a gender action plan, consultation and communication is key when you're trying to improve or develop a gender responsive procurement system. Listening to both internal stakeholders, but also questions that your suppliers ask will be a key part of your success. So some of the summarized steps for an action plan can be to securing first company-wide commitment and support. So really making sure that internally everybody is aware and aligned on your company's gender responsive procurement maturity levels, so where you stand and your goals, and also using specific numbers and targets as well as timeframes and budgets to achieve those goals. This also includes seeking support, so seeing if there is an external partner that you can work with. UN Women has launched the Gender Responsive Supply Chain Coalition, which is working on that issue. Then it's also about ensuring diverse teams and building their capacity. So within your procurement team, that they understand what gender responsive procurement is, what are your goals as a company within this, and then also understanding the diversity of your procurement team and ensuring that you have women and men buyers that may understand and relate to diverse suppliers. Of course, we always talk about setting performance and targets and tracking results. Progress is best seen when it's measured and then also celebrated. So that is always a key driver for us. This includes also having gender or sex disaggregated data on your suppliers, which leads us to the mapping of the suppliers. Some criteria can be is whether they are web signatories or not, so they have made a public commitment to gender equality. Are the companies owned by women or co-owned by women? What is how are women in the leadership, etc. So similar to some of the criteria that were mentioned with the gender bonds as well. And then, of course, engaging with current and future suppliers to adopt WEPs and help build their capacity. So after mapping, you can have a conversation with them and their stance on gender equality, and also communicate how important the topic is to you, and see how they could be part of the movement as well towards more gender responsive businesses. So in 2023, UN Women conducted a global pilot with a group of watch and jewelry companies to test the gender responsive procurement assessment tool and to also see where they stand more or less. And also in our recent surveys last year, we saw that expanding gender equality initiatives into the marketplace is increasingly a priority for companies, but it also remains one of the biggest challenges. So a lot of companies are working on the workplace issues already and have advanced there, but gender responsive procurement seems to be a bit daunting for some companies. So existing gaps still exist around gathering sex disaggregated data on the suppliers, integrating gender responsive procurement as part of the core business strategy, and of course, having KPIs to track progress towards a more gender responsive and inclusive supply chain management. So we've developed a set of recommendations that can be useful for those companies who are starting on this journey. First off, we always say start with commitments and putting them on paper. So develop a standalone gender responsive procurement policy, strategy, and action plan with clear indicators, clear targets. This helps you communicate, but it also helps you gain clarity on what you can achieve and how you will get there. Secondly, ensure there is effective support in the GRP implementation and monitoring process, including through the surveys and consultations. This includes budgets, it includes developing the systems, etc. Empower employees through gender responsive procurement training, and why this is a key part of your business rationale, how they can implement it. So what are concrete steps in reshaping current practices and relationships? This also includes actively building out and seeking women for procurement roles if you have a gender imbalance in that team, including managerial and executive procurement positions. As always, collect sex disaggregated data and report on progress made. So this transparency, communicating, reporting on the process and not just after a few years on the success is really important to also foster that culture within your business, but also within your sector. And then, of course, engage suppliers. So encourage them to sign on to the WAPs, encourage them to build their own capacity. And when the time comes, report the progress on gender equality and women's empowerment. Apologies. So we fully understand that this is a process both for the companies that are implementing it, but also for the suppliers. And there is a lot to gain from it in terms of business performance, but also having that influence and stepping up and developing that leadership in your sector for more gender equality. I hope today's session has inspired you to go back to your companies and take a step forward to advancing gender equality through gender responsive procurement. I would like to thank you very much for your attention on this part. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and we're happy to dive a bit deeper on gender responsive procurement with you. Thank you so much. Landon, I think I'm handing over to you again.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Alex. Really helpful overview. And while we do have you to put you on the spot a little bit, and it's fine if you don't have answers. You can always get back to some of the questions in the chat. But Nada asked about how to include gender equality in recruitment processes, or if you have any thoughts on applying gender equality approaches in a culture which is maybe perhaps traditionally more male-dominated. If you have any thoughts on either gender equality in recruitment or on approaching gender equality in maybe more traditionally male-dominated companies or industries, would love to hear it. Otherwise, I'm sure we can get back to Nada in the chat.
Sure, I think both of those are huge topics. So for the recruitment, we actually have a very useful checklist, and I'll link it in the chat. But there are various steps that go from how you develop the announcement to how the evaluation criteria is set. For example, we do know that there's difference in applications where I think this was a European-based study where men will apply if they fulfill 60% of the criteria and women if they fulfill 100%. So knowing this, reflect really how you develop your job description, and the criteria is all of it really necessary. And then it's also about the process. So who is involved in the decision making, which CVs get put on the table, which skills and capacities do you value, what experience do you value highest. So there's a lot of different entry points for gender responsive recruitment, and it is a key starting point to build that pipeline within your company, and also to build towards better gender representation across all of your positions. So great that you're looking into that part. And then when it comes to different cultures, we work in all cultures and across all different countries. And I think one thing that we have learned over and over is that it's really about a culture change that comes slowly, and progress comes with small steps. So it's not making the commitment from the leadership is a huge step, and it's very important. That's why we also say it is the CEO who has to sign and commit to gender equality. And then really that helps really integrate gender equality as part of the business model. So understanding how does it relate and support our business goals, and being able to communicate that on a consistent basis internally first, and then also externally. So there isn't an easy answer, but please do reach out to us, and we'd be really happy to continue the conversation on that and learn together.
Great. Thanks so much, Alex. Really helpful information, and you highlighted some great resources that, again, we'll try to share in the chat. But a lot of good information there. And as you say, two huge topics, but you did a great job covering two huge topics in that answer. And thank you again for that great overview on gender responsive procurement, as well as some useful action steps to take. We'll move along, and now that we've covered engaging suppliers through gender responsive procurement, we're going to move on to communicating a bit more widely to other external stakeholders. To kick this off, we'll do a quick Zoom poll to see how your organizations are currently disclosing with gender-related information. So does your company currently disclose gender-related information through one or more of these mechanisms or tools? Pardon me. So CSR, ESG, or sustainability reports, annual financial reports, perhaps your company discloses with a gender pay gap report. Maybe your company is doing all of the above, none of the above, or you're not sure today what or how your company discloses. Feel free to let us know in the chat as you fill this in. What do you think determines where gender-related information should appear? What factor are you looking for? If it should be in an annual financial reporting package, or perhaps using GRI standards and a sustainability report. Would love to hear if anyone has any thoughts, but we'll give it a few more seconds for any final answers. Okay, I think it's slowing down there, so let's see the results together. Okay, so majority are not sure. So hopefully after the training sessions this week, we encourage you to find out so that you can advocate or talk with the person responsible for the disclosure to see where you can disclose. But the biggest mechanism is CSR, ESG, or sustainability reporting. And then annual financial reports, I see some of you or your companies are using that. And then some are not currently using none of the above. And similar to if you're not sure, we encourage you to double check and see how you can start disclosing. Okay, so oops, there we go. So now on communication, who you communicate to defines where you report and then what standard you will use. So reporting to investors, the primary location for your gender-related disclosures will be in your annual report, where we saw a few of your companies currently using that mechanism. The ISSB has consolidated the major investor-oriented sustainability disclosure standards. And for reporting to other stakeholders, you might want to use the GRI standards, which are also widely used by organizations globally. And then together, these can form a holistic reporting package to a wide range of stakeholders. In terms of the content for each type of audience, for investors, you might focus your disclosure more on financially material risks and opportunities related to gender equality, as well as any other information that can help investors in their investment decisions and engagement with the company. As I said, this would go into an annual report alongside your financial statements and other disclosures. And then while communicating to broader stakeholder groups, you would report more about the impact of your business on the environment, society, and economy at large, as this will be more in line with what those stakeholders would want to know. And at the same time, that information will also be useful to some investors, and it still supports the information you reported on in that annual financial report using the ISSB. So back to annual financial reports, the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards requires your organization to disclose on 4 broad areas. which you might recognize if you were previously familiar with the TCFD. So ISSB S1 standard requires an entity to disclose information about all sustainability-related risks and opportunities that could reasonably be expected to affect the entity's cash flows or its access to finance or the cost of capital over the short, medium, or long term, so different time horizons. And the ISSB doesn't yet provide specific metrics or disclosure requirements on gender equality, but they do highlight that companies should make use of the SASB standards or GRI standards to identify appropriate disclosures for sustainability-related risks and opportunities. I want to go back to multi-stakeholder reporting. This is where GRI comes into play. We went through GRI standards and identified those that most directly address gender equality, hopefully to help you understand where to find guidance on gender equality disclosures for your own sustainability reports. Here we see 4 elements from GRI. We see the employees in 2-7. We see governance structure and composition. We see policy commitments and approach to stakeholder engagement, which are all gender-related disclosures as part of those broader categories. And you can see the references to the particular sections of the GRI 2 standard on the slide, and where you'll be able to find further information on those disclosures. There's also GRI 400. So you may know that GRI transitioned to a modular structure with the Universal Standards 2021. So topic standards like GRI 405 on diversity and equal opportunity and GRI 406 on non-discrimination still remain central to reporting on those specific topics. Organizations are now required to report their management approach on both of those topics following the requirements in GRI 3, Material Topics 2021. And this helps to ensure a consistent format describing how an entity can identify and manage its impacts. There's also GRI 202-1, where organizations must disclose the ratio of standard entry level wages by gender compared to the local minimum wage. And that provides a quantitative look at gender pay equity at the start of the employment cycle. I know that's a lot on standards, so I think it's always helpful to look through some case studies, and we have a few real world examples here to see what this looks like in reality and in practice. I'll note these examples are just excerpts from actual reports, so they're presenting a piece of a bigger, complete picture. These are examples of current practice, so we're not passing judgment on them as to whether they're good or bad practices. So first, we're going to look at an example disclosure on governance from the annual report of Airtel Africa. That's a Nigerian telecommunications company. So Airtel, in line with the IFRS, they reported the processes they use to monitor, manage, and oversee their sustainability-related performance. You can see they noted the non-financial performance KPIs linked to their sustainability strategy, which includes gender diversity. And then in the governance report, they also go into further detail on the specific initiatives and actions overseen by the board and its different committees in the reporting year. For example, the role of the nominations committee in reviewing executive remuneration. They also note that these KPIs are linked to that board's remuneration, which is a very strong incentive, I would say, for the board to take it seriously. Our next example on disclosure is strategy. So strategy disclosures aim to help the readers of your report to understand your strategy for managing sustainability-related risks and opportunities. Here we see the sustainability report of Astra International. That's an Indonesian conglomerate. Here, Astra outlines the importance of the diversity of its employees to their success. Importantly, this statement is then backed up by a roadmap and other actions you can see here on your screen in this table to manage the opportunity they see through having a more gender diverse workforce. Alongside this, Astra also goes into further details about how the company is implementing it, for example, through real world programs. One is making the workplace more suitable to women, and they also have a women's leader development program and then a women's network program, which is also for the broader workforce, not just for their employees. We pulled an interesting excerpt from the report. They say that human capital development covers three focus areas, which are to build an agile organization, develop passionate and energetic leaders so as to be able to navigate the organization in facing business challenges, as well as carrying out the culture of continuous improvement and innovation to maintain their relevancy in the era of disruptions. In other words, Astra International is stating that a more diverse and gender equal business can help to maintain their company's relevancy during this era of disruptions, which is an interesting insight into their strategic approach to gender equality. Next up, we have our third example disclosure on risk management. And here we're looking at L'Oreal, a French cosmetics company's annual report. They prepared their report in alignment with the ESRS. As a reminder, risk management disclosures are intended to help the reader of the report to understand your processes to identify, assess, prioritize, and monitor sustainability-related risks and opportunities. Here, L'Oreal provided an overview of how they go about identifying material-related impacts, risks, and opportunities using a double materiality lens, which includes the financial or investor materiality perspective of the ISSB. This is also alongside the impact materiality perspective, which considers the impact of issues on society and the environment. Let's see. Here in this disclosure, they explain the process they have to identify and assess material topics. That includes specific issues related, you can see here, on diversity, equity, and inclusion, including the stakeholder groups they consulted as part of the process. And then you see in this table for each material subtopic relating to D, E, and I, they also identify the policies and action plans in place to manage that risk or impact area. So quite thorough. Our last example disclosure is on metrics and targets. I know something we've discussed a lot over the last two sessions. And here we have an example from Cemex. That's a Mexican multinational cement company. Of course, this is in a traditionally male-dominated industry. And here, Cemex, in their annual report, notes that they're a signatory of the UN WEPs. They're also EDGE certified, and they're also a part of the UN Global Compact's target on gender equality. And here we see in this report, they're updating on the progress made towards gender equality in the workforce. As mentioned, they're in a traditionally male-dominated industry, so they're perhaps starting from a lower percentage of women than perhaps companies from some other industries. This example, I think, is a good one for showing that any business in pretty much any industry can take action towards gender equality, even in traditionally male-dominated industries. So here they set a new goal to increase the representation of women in senior management positions. Cemex specified the base year being 2022, their target of 30%, and then a target year of 2030, and you can see their annual reporting. I'll also note that they use some sex disaggregated metrics further on in the report. So they report on the percentage of workforce by gender, percentage of female employees by position, and they also report on women to men remuneration ratio by region. And again, it's something we've discussed in Monday's session and today. These sex disaggregated data points and metrics really help Cemex and their stakeholders better understand the progress towards their overall long-term goal to increase women's representation in organization in line with that 2030 target. I want to take a moment to mention on this element of disclosure and metrics and disclosures. We released a report just last year that provides the first comprehensive comparative assessment of gender-related disclosure metrics issued by stock exchanges and standard setters worldwide. So we review, for example, ISSB, GRI, ESRS, and so on. So here we provide an analysis of the gender equality disclosure metrics recommended by stock exchanges and the corporate reporting standard setters, like the ones I just mentioned. And then we benchmark these metrics against the UN Women's Empowerment Principles. The resulting data found some interesting gaps in subject matter coverage compared to the WEPs and some inconsistencies in the metrics recommended. So the report provides recommendations to improvements to the quality and the scope of these gender equality disclosure metrics. And we also used roundtable discussions with standard setters and other institutions to develop the recommendations. So I recommend you take a minute or two to check that report out. Now, I know we mentioned a lot of different standards, but there's also some additional organizations that you can look to for some more guidance on this topic. There's the guiding principles for you to consider, such as the UN Charter of Human Rights, the UN SDGs, which we discussed Monday, and of course the WEPs, which we've discussed Monday and today. In addition, it's also important to know what disclosures are required of your organization by your jurisdiction and by law. Then there's also a number of rankings or benchmarks to consider, like the World Benchmarking Alliance. And then, of course, there's a number of different indices and rating agencies that take into account these different social performance elements of companies, such as the Bloomberg indice that we discussed last session. So this provides an overview of some of the disclosure guidelines you can consider. But as well as considering disclosure standards, we previously also talked about standards and certifications that can be used to help develop your organization's gender equality processes and the internal processes. So these are referred to as performance management standards, which help to guide industry practices and also enhance your organization's performance on gender. One example would be the ISO 26000 guidance on social responsibility. And I'll note gender equality is also an element across many other ISO standards. There's also the SDG impact standards, which are management practice standards designed to help guide businesses and investors to embed sustainability into their decision-making approach. And last but not least, one set of standards that's highly relevant for gender equality is the EDGE certification, which we touched briefly on in our first session together. But today we're fortunate to have with us here today David Pritchett, the Managing Director of the EDGE Certified Foundation, to tell us a bit more about the important work that they're doing. So I'll turn it over to you, David.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Landon. Thanks, Fiona. Thanks to all of you participating and the opportunity to have a conversation a little bit about a different set of standards, but related very much to what you've heard on the webinar so far. I think it's good to sort of take stock and to look at these things as all being quite complementary. Standards and frameworks and regulations and ratings, etc. They usually have their own space, their own unique space for certain purposes and certain aims and objectives. And that's certainly what the case is around the EDGE certification, which is really a set of voluntary standards and a certification process around key indicators that drive fairness and equality in talent management and in talent career progression and fairness in workplace practices and policies, etc. And I go into a little bit what that means. It very much complements a lot of what you've seen in the reporting standards. This is a management performance standard. So if you like, it's one step before the reporting standards. It's driving a lot of the information which an organization needs to strategically manage the organization in this space and create long-term business value and have a set of metrics which you can use for disclosure thereafter. So it's very much driven by performance management and business performance rather than disclosure and aligning to a compliance for a disclosure requirement's sake. But it does very well fit together to a lot of what you heard, especially the UN WEPs, for example, which has been highly profiled here, which is a set of those standards which you can have to sort of look at where you are in terms of gender equality in the workplace and in your broad ecosystem. But we'll come to that, and I'm happy to answer any questions on the how this fits. Let me take you a little bit through what EDGE means and what it's about, and then we can talk a little bit about the value of what that creates and how it differs from maybe some of the other frameworks that we've talked about. It's an independent third-party system, which means that the data and the information which an organization manages to drive gender equality performance is also independently verified from a third-party auditor. So that gives this sort of credibility, integrity, and trust to the data from a management perspective, very much like a sort of a financial audit, but light. We're not going for a true and fair view, but we're looking much more at a set of assurance procedures over this kind of information. So we're moving towards the robustness and the integrity of information before it gets disclosed, obviously, to all third parties through reports or through other communications of the organization. I work in the foundation, which sets the kind of rules and the standards and the guidelines for this standard. We work with Edge Strategy, a commercial partner who helps organizations to get prepared for certification. We work very closely with IFC, especially in markets like Egypt and Northern African markets, but also Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America. A lot of IFC portfolio companies go through this process because the IFC partner with us, because they felt that the Edge standards gave a very holistic assessment of where an organization stands with respect to gender equality in the workplace. And it helps them to have that basis for them to be able to tailor their capacity building services for the organizations that they work with. The organization who wants to go through this will work with Edge Strategy or IFC, and then they'll work with the third-party certification bodies to get certified. That's a little bit how the system works. Let me take you through the two standards just briefly. There's two standards. There's an Edge gender binary standard, but we've also, 5 years ago, set up an Edge and intersectional equity standard, which looks at women in combination with other dimensions of diversity. So we fully understand that there are career hurdles and there are career characteristics with regard to how talent management is affecting women which have other dimensional or other dimensions of diversity as part of the assessment that needs to be made up. And we've seen that it enriches an organization's performance analysis to understand the impact of those dimensions, not only gender, but other dimensions on career trajectory of different people within an organization, both women and men. So there's a lot that an organization can get out of running such an in-depth analysis. The Edge standards go a little bit deeper than some of the reporting standards and some of the other standards and frameworks which you've talked about. They really go down very deeply into a talent management sort of system and process within an organization. We look at three sources of information. We look at data, we look at representation data, at different levels of management of the organization, different job types. We look at the different responsibilities of different roles, different functions, etc. In fact, there's 12 different areas where we look at representation. So all the sort of the core value drivers of gender equality performance in an organization, we will break that down from a representation perspective at different levels of management. So we will look at the top talent data. We will look at performance management data, parental leave policies and data. We will look at mentoring and sponsorship and coaching type of data. We will look at part-time, full-time data. We will look at responsibility of the role, core functions, people managers, individual contributors. There's a lot of sort of, if you're working in HR, sort of the key management processes that you have to manage talent. We will be looking at that from both a gender and intersectional lens at different levels of the organization. We look at pay. Obviously, pay is a key driver of fairness in the organization and how transparent an organization is on pay, how they're assessing it, and how they're communicating those topics within the organization. We look at the effectiveness of policies and practice. So a little bit on the other side of the data, we're understanding the architecture and infrastructure of an organization, of the maturity of different policies and practices to help drive a certain equitable career flows within an organization. And then we take a test of the inclusiveness of the culture, which means every employee of an organization is invited to respond to a survey, which drives a set of experiences aligned very much with the key topics that we look at in the data and in the policies and practices. So it's really triangulating The real value here is that we're triangulating the data with the policies, practices, and with the perceptions to understand where there may be differences and gaps in between some of these pieces of information. Often you see that an organization says that they do a lot and they perceive that they do a lot, but the employees don't understand or don't experience that same level of commitment from an organization as the leadership may be trying to portray. Or there may be a lag between how quickly the organization can put into place policies without how quickly the data actually moves and can become more representative over time. So it's interesting to look at that, and we do projections, obviously, of, should an organization over a 12-month period have a certain set of policies and practices and have a certain trend in the data, projecting that over 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years, what would that look like in terms of your career pipeline and talent management and representation within your organization across those timeframes. There's 4 levels of certification, sorry. There's the Edge Assess, which is the sort of who's committing. There's no barriers to entry, so there's no need for an organization to show a certain performance before they get certified. An organization who goes through this analysis and commits to creating an action plan to improve will be certified at one of these 4 levels of certification, depending on their performance. So it's something which fits to the early the early starters in this area, those that are sort of just becoming aware of this and are just starting to assess where they stand, to those who maybe have some quite maturity in the policies, practices, and their performance in this area. And it gives you that sort of continuous improvement journey and opportunity. The Edge Plus relates to the Edge, which is gender and intersectional equity. So organizations who do measure gender in intersection with another dimension can be Edge Plus certified. That was a lot of sort of theoretical information about what the Edge standards look at. Perhaps I'll just show you 2 examples of organizations that we work with and some of the benefits that they've seen with this work. That can give you a bit of a sense of the value that they've been able to get out of it. The first one is an energy sector company. This was in an emerging market. They've been through 3 cycles of certification with us. So that's 3 sets of certification analysis, 2020, 2022, and 2024. The key aim for them was the representation data, very classical. They had difficulty. They had sort of a broken rung in their career ladder for women, especially. They were able to attract less than 30% women at junior management, but they weren't able to retain them, or they weren't promoting them optimally up to upper management and top management. And they wanted to look at what measures they could take to actually help improve that proportionality of women in the pipeline through the different levels of management. And so they created an action plan based on, obviously, first of all, understanding the data, understanding the recruitment and the promotion practices, understanding the leadership development training and professional training and development and mentoring and sponsorship, etc., but also understanding the maturity of the policies and how fair they were being implemented within the organization. And from that, they were able to tweak some of those things and optimize the systems and de-bias some of those systems where they were needed. They were able to, over a course of, this is 6 years of data ultimately, show tangible increase in their numbers with regard to representation. I know this graph is a bit small. It shows the junior, middle, upper, and top management levels and the representation of women in the workforce. They were, as Landon said, starting from a sector which was traditionally very male-dominated, a little bit like Cemex. This is not Cemex, but it's in a similar kind of energy sector, which has that sort of type and characteristics to it. But nevertheless, through fairness of systems and processes, they were able to attract more talent and retain that talent within their organization. The second one is in a financial services industry. This is, has different types of challenges, but ultimately, sort of converging issues with regard to retaining women in the workplace. This organization didn't have very good policies and practices which were supporting their ambitions. They had ambitions to reach a certain amount of attraction and retention of women in the workplace, but the policies and practices were not really supporting that level of ambition. And what they wanted to do was to make sure that they put in place policies and practices which would actually help them to drive better performance in that talent pipeline and equitable ways of working with both women and men in the workforce. And so we help them on assessing where they stood on that and giving them a roadmap of how they could improve that. What we don't do at Edge is we don't do any of the consulting work. That's the kind of work that IFC would do with these organizations to capacity build in markets such as Egypt and others, where they have a lot of experience in knowing from the local culture and the local business needs what works and what potentially doesn't in that setting. And so this organization over 2 years was quite quickly able to show a higher maturity. And this line denotes the 65%, which is the Edge standard. Sort of there's 30 plus different types of policies and practices that we're looking for here. And we're taking a balanced weighting of those, the way that we score this, together with the experiences of that. So an organization is not going to benefit from purely putting in place a policy and practice unless the organization and the employees have a fairly high level of perception of how well it's implemented. So that's another key element of this when you're looking at purely a policies and practices perspective. Just a sort of a word on the types of organizations we work with. They're very much global. We work with organizations in 77 countries, so not just the large multinationals in developed markets necessarily, the traditional markets. We do work with international finance organizations, UN agencies, but also some not-for-profit organizations, and a number in different markets around the world in different sectors. So it's not really a sort of a sector-based or a market-based standard. It's very much a global standard which organizations can tailor to their needs in terms of finding their own pathways through the Edge certification system to create business value. I think in Egypt at the moment, one of the latest organization we have is the Wadi Group. You're probably familiar with that in the sort of the agribusiness and the food products. They certified very recently with us and are now going through, you see them here, they're going through an action plan and performance enhancement plan. I think they're on a good track with working with the IFC to put that in place. Happy to take any questions if there's any further interest. Thanks.
Great, brilliant. Thank you so much for that, David. Really comprehensive as ever. We didn't get any dedicated questions, but we did have a question that came through earlier in the session, which I think you'd have an interesting perspective on. So I'll pick that one up if that's okay.
Yeah,
So
sure.
one of our participants, Nada, was asking particularly about, I guess, the challenges of trying to advance gender equality in kind of quite male-dominated working cultures, and maybe how to overcome some of the challenges that could be particularly faced there. And I know from some of your case studies of working with organizations on this, you've got some good examples there. So I just wondered if there's any particular insights, I guess, you'd share from those case studies about maybe the approaches that those organizations took in quite male-dominated sectors.
Yeah, that's a very good question. It does come up quite a lot. We also work with organizations that have the opposite. We work very closely with L'Oréal, for example, in different markets. And L'Oréal, you can imagine, in the personal product sector, has a huge amount of employee intake, women intake, and it has at the operational level and the junior management level especially has sometimes 75%, 80% women working. And so it's the opposite issue for that. And that's a complete different scale, but it's interesting to sort of look, holistically at these things. For male dominance, I think it's, the way we address this is that an organization starts wherever they are. When we respect the industry, we respect the talent pools which are around all these industries and where the organizations are taking their employees from. We respect the nature of the work which is being undertaken, the flexible, the working conditions which some of the organizations might be undertaking, and that's fully understandable. And is the aim, I think, of any standard or framework is not to try to get to 50-50 for every single organization in every market, in every industry. It's much more about, for us in any case, equitable career flows and having equal opportunities. So it's about looking at within an organization and starting, let's say, at a very unbalanced level, but looking at, when an organization is going through recruitment and promotion practices, for example, how fair are those policies and practices? How fair are the performance management processes and practices? And is there the same proportion of women given the same opportunities to be promoted within the organization as men? It doesn't mean the overall number of women is going to be high, but it may be the same proportion, which is 5% of women who are up for promotion get promoted, and the same proportion of men get promoted. And then you get this kind of, you're able to raise the representation and keep that same representation throughout the different levels of management, which is what ultimately I think most of the organizations are looking for, which is a little bit of a better gender balance at the most senior management level, because that they will then help drive a certain culture and give sort of peer-to-peer opportunities, mentoring and sponsorship opportunities throughout the organization thereafter. So it sort of triggers sort of a knock-on effect in many ways. And we find that organizations that are able to maintain that proportionality throughout their different hierarchy are better off than those that parachute maybe women into senior roles from outside the organization who haven't had that same fairness of opportunity, and they struggle to retain women more than those that have a better sort of career pipeline. Anyway, that's a little bit of a long answer to that question, but
not at all. I appreciate it. It's a big topic, so thanks for taking a good stab at that. And yeah, I think some really fascinating insights there. So thanks very much for sharing that. I think some great thoughts. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for joining us again as guest speaker. We really appreciate it. So we're coming towards the close of the session now. So I'll just be covering a few quick points of wrap up. One of those was just to revisit our kind of comfort and understanding on these topics. Now we're at the end of the training workshop today. So Landon's reshared that link with you in the chat. So you can let us know there how you're feeling now. Feel free to answer honestly as well. It's always helpful for us to understand how effective our training is here and any ways we can improve it. So we understand we won't have completely solved this issue for you today, but hopefully we've given you some insights to help you move forward. And thanks for those letting us know about that on the poll. So I'll just go back to share a few quick slides briefly as we close out, just to share a few resources that you can take away to continue to support you and your learning on this topic. So firstly, just a reminder, of course, that all of the presentations from today, the recordings of the sessions, and a resource sharing a number of academic publications that have informed our work are all available to download from the event page for today's session under resources, which we've shared with you in the chat. Also, just to mention that within the handout for today's presentation, you'll find this list per unit of training of lots of different resources and tools that you can look at. So I won't talk all that through, but just to show you that those slides are there and available for you to take a look at in your own time. Oh, I've gone one too far, because one good resource that I just want to highlight as well from our partners at the IFC is their Beyond the Balance Sheet program, a really great host of resources designed, I guess, particularly to support emerging markets on these topics. So lots of really good materials and further learning resources that you can check out from this resource from IFC. One practical point I know is really important to mention to everyone today is how to get your completion certificate for taking part in the training. So we're really grateful for the time and energy you've put into today's workshop and Mondays. So to get your certificate, we'd love you to fill out the feedback survey, which we'll share with you in the chat just now. So that feedback survey is also good for us to get your feedback, of course, but if you fill that out, we'll send the certificate to the email address that you complete the survey at. So give us around a week to send out your certificate. But if there are any issues receiving your certificate after a week, be sure to double check it's not gone to your spam folder, and otherwise you can reach out to us at the contact details in our presentation if you are having any problems. And then finally, just to share the contact details from our partner organizations for the training. A big thank you again to Guillaume and David for joining us as guest speakers. And of course, a thank you to the SSE official supporters who help make this work possible, including the Egyptian Exchange. So thank you to the team for your ongoing support here. I see Mustafa and Maya are both there. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to say quickly as we close the session out.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fiona, for this. We came to the end of today's workshop. But I would like to extend my sincere appreciation to all our distinguished panelists and our amazing attendees that they show valuable contribution, active participation. I really appreciate that. And one of the things that I really on personal level that I enjoyed a lot, the insightful discussion and the practical tools that you shared through the full 4 modules over the last 2 days. It was really amazing, and it equipped us with the practical knowledge and how can we implement it and how to take the knowledge to be practical on ground. This training is not just a training, it's one of our stops in our journey at EGX to reduce the gap between the gender. We are one of the signatories of the WEPs since 2016, and we have the pleasure to be the first stock exchange to host this training back to 2024. And this is we would like to repeat it in the future, and we would like to encourage all our markets to take this opportunity. Gender equality is an economic opportunity, but if we wear the right lens to look at the topic and the issue. And we have an important announcement, and I will leave my colleague Mayar to deliver at the end of the session related to our next workshops in the collaboration with the UNSSE. At the end, I would like to thank you so much, Fiona. Thank all the team of the UNSSE, IFC, and Mr. David and UN Women. Thank you so much, and we are looking forward to our active collaboration in the future. Mayar, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, there is nothing else to say, to be honest. Thank you all for being part of today's webinar and workshop for these 2 days. Maybe it's a little bit intensive, however, we are all contributing for capital markets that have in gender inclusion. For the upcoming trainings, we are actually very happy to partnership with the SSE in 3 other workshops. You will find them in the chat as I put them, and you can find them also at the SSE page. Please feel free to register and to make it for any other team you can think that they can benefit from them. Thank you again, Fiona. Thank you, Landon. Thank you, all of the participants.
Thank you very much again, Maya, Mustafa, and as you say, a great reminder to participants to take a look at those future workshops as well. So it's great to be collaborating so actively together with your exchange over the coming months. So big thank you for all of your support as well. So as we close out, just a final thank you from my side to all of our participants for joining us today, to Alexandra and the team at UN Women as well, our partners at IFC and the Luxembourg government for their support. So we'll close the session there. A big thank you once again, everyone, and we'll look forward to seeing you again at a future training. Wishing you a good rest of your day.